The work that I'm doing now with a co-author, Veronika Lipinska, is basically developing the proactionary principle into a kind of overarching imperative. The proactionary principle was developed by Max Moore in 2004 in a manifesto in explicit opposition to the precautionary principle. And I think those two principles, precautionary and proactionary, will be defining the ideological space in which political conflict occurs in the future. The precautionary principle basically being about a sort of risk-averse strategy that basically aims to minimize harm in whatever interventions one engages in. So let's say with regard to any sort of political activity or medical activity and ecological activity. Whereas the proactionary principle actually believes in a much more experimental approach, a risk-seeking approach. You might even say a kind of no pain, no gain approach to the way in which we make progress in the world. And both of these views, the precautionary and proactionary views, are in fact claimed basis in science. The precautionary principle basically stresses the uncertainty that science, as it were, reveals about the way our understanding of the world. And as a result, the caution that we must exercise in doing things. The proactionary principle operates on the assumption that in order to learn anything about the world, one has to do experiments, one has to intervene, that it's not sufficient simply to rely on past knowledge or to be excessively cautious. In fact, that if one looks at the history of science, that's been the name of the game. Namely, that people have taken enormous amounts of risks and have had great payoffs, even though there have been also some negative consequences along the way. So it's that fundamental optimism about the way in which we can improve the human condition through science that's been behind the proactionary imperative. The problem with the proactionary principle as originally stated, which we are trying to address in our book, is that it tends to have an overly libertarian emphasis. Namely, it's basically that people should just be allowed to do these kinds of experimental things. But in fact, there is actually quite a lot of risk that you're exposing both people and society to, and it's not clear that even in the cases where the risks succeed, that everyone in society actually gets to benefit from it, or when in fact they don't succeed, whether we learn anything collectively from it. And so in this book, The Proactionary Imperative, what we're trying to do is to set up a kind of a sort of social welfare system that actually encourages people to be risk-taking, but at the same time also compensates for the negative consequences that may happen as a result of this risk-taking. Well, the precautionary principle is basically too conservative in terms of what it would allow human beings to do. And in fact, I think, in a way, the situation that we have now with the institutional review boards with regard to scientific research that actually put enormous amounts of constraints on what can be done, to the extent that even if people give their consent, they're not allowed to be involved in certain kinds of experiments that could possibly harm them, even if they have to give consent. I think that's an excessive use of the precautionary principle. Also, I think there is this view about the environment whereby I think there's this belief that if the human population expands and continues to transform the environment, that it'll destabilize the entire ecosystem and that the whole planet will be destroyed. I think that's, again, an excessively conservative viewpoint that has not been borne out by all the transformations that we've in fact made to the planet that have, in a sense, left us stronger in the end. So I think that there's a sense in which there's a lack of faith in the power and the intelligence of humanity that's presupposed by the precautionary principle. Whereas the proactionary principle, I think, under the right kind of social and political arrangements, is in fact the better way to go. The biggest obstacle to the proactionary principle being put into effect is the fact that it just seems too risky. It seems to license anything, and as a result, a lot of people could be put very much at risk, including people who aren't directly involved in the risk-taking. And I think this is where, in a sense, we need to reconceptualize the welfare state to actually encourage risk-taking, but also to securitize it in the sense that we actually provide adequate safeguards, compensation when people harm themselves as a result of taking all these risks, so that we actually live in a culture that encourages risk and rewards risk-taking. And so this is going to require quite a lot of rethinking, it seems to me. And the other thing I think is going to be very important for the proactionary principle is that everyone learns of the consequences of the risk-taking, regardless of whether it goes well or it goes poorly. That, as it were, risks are not things that are simply privately absorbed, either in their positive or negative side, but everyone learns from them and everyone benefits from them. And that's in a sense where I think we are drawing a very strong distinction politically between ourselves and the more libertarian focus of the people who currently support the proactionary principle. There is a very strong conservative bias in the precautionary principle, though the precautionary see themselves usually as being on the left. But I think one of the things that this shows is that there's a sense in which the ideological poles are shifting, and that the old left-right distinctions do not adequately capture what's at stake between the precautionary and proactionary principles. It's really an issue about risk-taking versus risk aversion. Okay? And to me, that is going to be the new progressive versus conservative. The progressive people will be the ones who encourage and provide for risk-taking, and the new conservatives are going to be the ones who are averse to risk-taking. Well, the proactionary principle is kind of a no pain, no gain principle, frankly, right? In other words, if you want to find out something about the world that's really important and useful, you've got to take risks. You have to do experiments. You cannot just rely on past knowledge, okay? And risks come both with costs and with benefits. And that's what Marx says as a human being, as human beings, as opposed to all other creatures, is we have been bold enough to take those risks. Other creatures stay within the comfort zone of adaptation. We try to transcend those boundaries all the time, and we, for the most part, have succeeded. And that's what Marx is as a species. And the proactionary principle is basically a statement of that as a matter of policy. And I think there's a sense in which that in action, that the world is always moving, regardless of what we do, and just doing the same thing will not look the same in the future as it has in the past. That's for sure. Yes, and I think that there's a sense in which there may be a kind of fallacy in the precautionary principle's way of thinking, in this idea of sustainability, where the idea is you're always supposed to keep the resources kind of constant, you want to keep populations constant, as if that were possible, as if a sort of steady state idea of reality were something that could just be actively maintained.